Well, thank you. Well, yeah, I want to say, so Southampton is actually leading two big multidisciplinary projects on deltas and the future of deltas. So I'm going to talk today about one project, the ESPA Delta project, but there are other related work going on. This is a project that's in progress, so I've got by no means any final results. So I'll just give you a flavour of the why are we doing this and how are we approaching it really. And it's again, this is the ESPA Delta project. Is ESPA stands for Ecosystem Services for Poverty Alleviation, and we're looking at this issue in deltas, and we're particularly in the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta in Bangladesh. And so I'd like to thank, acknowledge basically again, it's a team effort. There's a large number of UK partners, a very big Bangladeshi team, and also contributions from Indian and Chinese partners as well. And to kind of give you a flavour, really, give a structure here, I want to say a little bit about deltas. Why are they important? Then we'll talk a bit about the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta and Bangladesh in particular. It actually goes across the national border, part of it's in India. Talk about the project we're working on, and then look at some of the food production and fisheries, some of the ecosystem services that we're looking at within this project, and some concluding thoughts about where we're going with this work. So what is a delta? I suppose you probably know what a delta is, but I think it's probably worth just defining it in case you're not sure. And so this is the Nile Delta. So it's really basically where a river reaches the sea and sediment gets deposited and all the nutrients and water. So you can see the huge contrast here in the Nile between the desert, because there's essentially no rainfall. The only source of water here is the Nile, and the very fertile Nile Delta, where approximately 50 million people live today, to kind of give you a scale. And Cairo is about here, where the delta starts to form. And I mean, it's interesting when you go back. I mean, some people have argued that the formation of the ancient Egypt civilization was actually linked to a slowing of sea level and the creation of the delta. That the creation of civilization here was actually sort of linked to the environmental change of slowing down of climate change and sort of historical climate change and the formation of the delta. Now, deltas are a few key facts. They're one of the most fertile environments. When we were looking at this call on ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, where in the coasts would this be important? Well, we felt deltas. There's 500 million people living in deltas worldwide, and they're depending on the fertility and the sort of ecosystem services of these environments. And you say they're so densely populated often. Not all deltas are densely populated, but many are. And they have large rural populations that are living on subsistence-based agriculture. But they're dynamic. There's other things going on as well. They do contain large and growing cities and urbanisation. That's not the main focus of this project, but it's important to recognise that. There's often high poverty levels linked with the rural populations, and these systems are under multiple threats from natural and human drivers. One of the things that springs to most people's minds, deltas form at sea level, so the elevations are very close to sea level. So if we look at sea level rise, this is from the AR5 IPCC Working Group 1 assessment published late last year, showing how sea levels were stable up to about 1800. They then seem to have started to rise, and into the future, building on what Tim was saying about rising temperatures, we'd expect to see an acceleration in the rise in sea level, threatening the more seaward parts of the deltas with increased flooding, inundation, and also salinisation. I mean, so salt pushing into areas that are presently fresh water. But when we look at a number of deltas, and these are just this is from the SRTM, so these are global digital elevation models produced by satellite, and the pink areas are below sea level. So actually in the Ganges, you don't see much pink. But if you go here, say, to the Vistula, for example, which is actually in Poland, or the Yellow River here, you see very large areas that are below sea level, and these are essentially polders. They're living the agricultural area is there because it's living behind a defence. And so these areas are actually subsiding. I mentioned this point in my lecture this morning in the context of cities, but the same broadly, deltas are sinking, so that exacerbates any global induced sea level rise. And when you put these together, this is using people as an index here how many people might be forced to move by 2050 just based on current trends of observed sea level rise and the fact that the land is sinking. And you can see that maybe the Mekong, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, which we're studying here in this Esper Delta project, and the Nile come out in the sort of top tier of where you might see the biggest changes. But many deltas seem to be threatened, so you can sort of see across Asia, Africa, and into the Americas. Then moving on now, just to look at the Ganges Brahmaputra Delta, the subject of the talk here, we have, there's not a national border on the satellite image, but it's been added for you, so you can see that's Bangladesh. This is India. Up here we have the Himalayas. And here is the Ganges and some of its tributaries coming down from the Himalayas. And then here's the Brahmaputra, which sort of rises up in the Tibet Plateau and comes around in this way, joins together, and produces basically about 1 billion tons of sediment per year are coming down is the estimate. So that's a very large amount of sediment. And the area of the delta, which is sort of defined maybe as the material that's been deposited in the last few thousand years, is more than 100,000 square kilometres of land. A population of 130 million people just in this one delta living on that surface. We do have some pretty big cities, Calcutta and Dhaka. We have the Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, which is here. It's got the largest number of Bengal tigers in the world. I mean, at one time, this whole area would have been mangrove, but it's been cleared. We'll see land use there in a moment. And as I say, water coming from the Himalayas down. So there's transboundary issues in terms of most of the catchment of this system lies outside Bangladesh. And just to sort of, to give you, to zoom in a little bit more, I mean, floods are often, again, associated, maybe people associate them with sort of climate change. We've had floods in Britain, but deltas are built by floods. So flooding is a normal part of life in a delta, as sort of shown here. I mean, but looking at other aspects, this is rice paddy. And what you also see when you go around coastal Bangladesh is you see lots of earthen dikes. You see lots of ability to control and move water. It's obviously essential if you're going to have rice as a crop. So you see lots of small-scale engineering, and these are really essentially what we call polders, in the Dutch word, but they are areas where these structures are being used to regulate water levels in the land behind. Although this land is obviously at the same time probably flood-prone if there's a storm or some event that overtops it. We also find aquaculture, and there's an interesting trend I'll mention again of a movement from rice paddy to saltwater aquaculture and the production of shrimp, which is largely exported to people like us who consume it. And then subsidence. That I think again it's important to emphasise the fact that this delta is sinking. All the evidence, we don't find any evidence of stability. Everywhere you can measure things, the land seems to be losing elevation at varying rates. And lastly, huge numbers of people in these very large cities. But I mean, Bangladesh has 100 million people in it in the country. I said 130 million people in the delta, but 100 million people living in Bangladesh. And the population density, if you look at us, most countries with 100 million people plus have relatively low population densities. Bangladesh is like 10 to 20 times higher. There's just no space in this environment for people to really move. There's also, I mentioned the issue of ecosystem services, and there's a wide range of ecosystem services within the delta that are summarised here, and probably John Deering has done an assessment of trends in these ecosystem services within Bangladesh as part of the project. And what is clear is that the provisioning services are increasing, that we are seeing growth in agriculture, we're seeing growth in aquaculture, so there's a lot of more production of food going on, but that the regulating services are in decline. So again, and it's sort of he's observed a similar kind of pattern in the lower Yangtze River basin in China. So there's sort of but that's just observed on what's happened. That's not a prognosis. That's just putting together all the data sets that you can to describe this system. So the Esper Delta project. Here's a sort of meeting of the team in Southampton last June. or a few weeks ago actually in the Indian Sundarbans, not in the Bangladeshi Sundarbans. So we have this very large team that are looking at this question. And the next slide really just outlines the kind of structure. How are we thinking about this project? I should note the title, Assessing Health, Livelihoods, Ecosystem Services and Poverty Alleviation in Populous Deltas. That's the actual title of the full title of the project. And it's structured as follows. We have a sort of work package 1, which is very much about governance and stakeholders, where rather than taking a view of, we'll go in and answer, we'll define a set of questions as experts, we're doing this in a very participatory way, in that we're identifying the stakeholders within Bangladesh who are interested in the future of the Delta over the next 10, 20, up to sort of 50 years was our original timescale. In fact, we find talking to the stakeholders, they want to know about to 2100. So there's actually they're interested in longer timescales than we expected. What are the issues? Did I turn the light on or something? What are the issues that they are concerned about? What are the questions that they wish to answer? And so then we take those issues into some work packages looking at model conceptualization, looking at this issue between ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. What are the relationships? That then moves on into a socioeconomic work package, which is doing a lot of work on demography. It's looking at analysis of the census and looking at indicators of poverty. It's also doing a household survey, which is trying to test some of the hypotheses that are mentioned here. So the D indicates data collection. We also have and this should really say biophysical model work package that's looking at understanding the delta, the input of fresh water today, and the changes in the delta due to things like flooding, salinization, land loss. Drawing that all together into a sort of an integrated model here, which we then take back to the stakeholders all the time through. We're developing scenarios with the stakeholders, so we're asking the questions that they want with the future of the world that they have helped to create, and then we're looking at, well, what does the analysis suggest? Where is the trajectory taking us? And then having a dialogue about, well, what bits don't you like? What would you do? And then going back through this process, one cycle. So it's an idea of sort of co-learning with the stakeholders in Bangladesh. So hopefully that's just given you very quickly the philosophy of how we're thinking about this. Our study area, I mean, really the whole country, you could argue, is the Delta. We're actually taking the coastal part of Bangladesh, which is essentially the tidally influenced part. So the tides really run to about here. We have the city of Khulna in the north of our study area. And it's about 14 million people live in this study area. And to kind of give it more as a sort of cartoon, then so we've got the river basin above. Our study area is fairly small, but we're also thinking about the Bay of Bengal because we're thinking about fisheries. And so we have the exogenous drivers, things like climate change, but also how the upstream flow diversions might change, things like world food prices as well, as sort of boundary conditions. Endogenous issues, how Bangladesh is managing its environment, things like the flood protection strategies, and then sort of in terms of looking at our study area, looking at various processes, we recognise that land use, land cover and how it changes is a fundamental sort of meeting point for all the work that we're doing, and we're looking at these different types of issues, so agriculture, aquaculture, the mangroves, the inland fisheries, the offshore fisheries, and their interrelationships. And also recognising the role, which is partly coming from the endogenous aspects, the demography, migration, markets, and all these other sort of socioeconomic factors that need to be, that are interacting with the land use and the land cover. And so just to give again a flavour, the land use in 2010, we spent a lot of time. We didn't really plan to do all this work, but as when you take on projects, you sometimes learn that there are aspects that need to be developed that you didn't realise when you wrote the proposal. And so this is the Sundarbans. This is the large, extensive mangroves and national park. Then most of the land use is agriculture, both irrigated and non-irrigated. And then these purple areas are interesting because they've appeared in the last 20 years, and these are paddy that have gone to aquaculture. So this is an important land use change that is occurring, and which we are looking to understand much better than we do. And then if we look at census-based measures of poverty, so we're not explaining the poverty, we're just looking at indicators again from the census. The household survey will try and dig into this in more detail. What we see around the Sundarbans is this red area, so we see an arc of poverty around the Sundarbans. There are other spots here and there, and others of relative wealth, like down here. These are actually fissures down here. But round here, this is an area which is higher salinity. So again, the hypothesis is that maybe the high salinity is leading here to poverty, and also maybe also encouraging some of these land transitions, because there is less fresh water in the rivers for irrigation in the dry season. And so then, to give you a flavour of what we're trying to do, we're building this sort of our tool, Delta Diem, and it's has a number of different elements. The red elements here are sort of biophysical elements. The green are more to do with socioeconomics, economics and sort of poverty issues. And so we're putting this together. And just to give you a flavour, this is still under development. Just want to look at maybe some of the agricultural aspects. So we've got CropWatt, the person, so an agricultural model. The person that wrote that works in my faculty and is sort of helping to translate that into this framework, and how that links with demography and different crop types. So the key to understanding the future is looking at numbers of people. We do want to be thinking about migration in and out of this region. What we observe is that this region right now seems to be people are migrating out of this region today. We estimate that about 2 million people have left in the last 10 years, according to the census. And sort of, again, a first cut of that is that we expect to see population continue to fall in some areas in the region, and population around Khulna to actually increase, and probably overall a small net increase, but that will be subject to the specific scenarios that we look at. Overall, sort of again, things up here like life expectancy is rising significantly in Bangladesh, although family size is really about replacement level at the present time. And so looking at agriculture, so it's about 80% of Bangladesh's population currently live in rural areas. There's a strong urbanizing trend, so that figure is getting smaller with time. And over half of them are actually currently employed in agriculture, and it's a big part of the GDP. And if we look here over time, these are the production index, we can see again a growth in production, particularly after around about the mid-1990s. I mean, but it's a general increase, but then an acceleration in that. Back to the point that the provisioning services I mentioned earlier are growing. Bangladesh, a big issue is to be self-sufficient in food, and that's a very high priority for the government. And they are currently achieving that goal. Again, will they be able to into the future is one of the questions that we want to ask and answer, because if they're not self-sufficient, I think that would certainly trouble them as a result, as an outcome. And then with this CropWatt model, we can actually start to look at what might the future production be across a number of unions. So these are geopolitical units here, unions. There's about 600 or so of these in these maps, showing you the production in different years, and imagining the salinity increases again by an arbitrary 5 parts per thousand by 2050. I mean, we're going to have proper numbers from other work in the meantime. And what you see is really that the typical almond rice really ceases to. There's major loss in productivity if the soil salinity rises by that amount. So it's saying that this scenario looks a big problem. And so there's no land loss in here. This is not increased flooding. This is just salt causing this effect, and salinization of soil salination. But we can look at, CropWatt allows us to look at a lot of other crops, and what we observe is that farmers are looking, in many cases, to diversify their production, and there are higher value crops. So we can look at a lot of different crops within the model, and to look at baskets of things that people might grow. We can also play games with genetic engineering. What if they can make a more salt-tolerant rice? I mean, it doesn't exist, but we can actually ask, in a model, you can actually ask those kinds of questions. How much time does it buy you? It might only buy you a little bit of time. It might buy you a lot of time. It depends on how things unfold in the future. And I think looking at this salinisation scenario, we see that changes. The business as usual is not an option. Changes will be necessary. And you can look at sort of the ideas of crop diversification, maybe value addition. Some of these have higher cash value, better management, or people having multiple jobs, land conversion to aquaculture, people migrating out of the region. I mean, there's a lot of options that would need to be thought through. Aquaculture as well is going on, as I've already said, and say globally, 2.5% of global shrimp production is coming from Bangladesh, and it's certainly an important export industry, and it employs a lot of people, but it employs a lot less people than rice production. So when you move to aquaculture and shrimp production, you actually employ less people. But informally, many households also have their own pond. So there's this traditional aquaculture is also practiced, and there's a lot of work around collecting the fry, etc., for the aquaculture. And fish is a very important part of the diet in Bangladesh, with about sort of 60% of animal-related sort of protein coming from that. If we look at sort of more fisheries production, the trends are shown here, and that fisheries production has also increased with time, and the expectation from the government is that they're expecting to increase that by about 25% by 2021. And is that possible? And I suppose the work that we're actually looking at, Plymouth Marine Labs are looking at modelling the Bay of Bengal fisheries, and actually a lot of the inland fisheries are essentially the same species which come in, a bit like salmon, into the freshwater for parts of their life cycle. So they're strongly correlated with the saltwater fisheries. And what's been found with the modelling so far, at least, again, this is preliminary, the final, is that there's no evidence of a collapse of the fisheries, and there's no real evidence of an increase. So it seems like the resource is going to be there into the future, but there's not going to be more of it, but equally there's not going to be a collapse. And I think as well as modelling the resource, then PML will also look at different strategies for exploiting that, and how you can maybe get sort of the maximum sustainable yields and things like that. So some concluding thoughts. Hopefully I've given you a flavour of the work we're doing and how it sort of relates to the issue of agriculture and sort of aquaculture and fisheries in the delta. And these issues are probably happening in all the other deltas of the world. So these are broader issues here. And so, it's certainly that this system is under multiple threats. We've got sea level rise, we've got the land sinking. There's the likelihood that India will divert more water from the rivers, so there'll be less fresh water coming in from the catchments upstream. So there's big changes coming along, and the people in Bangladesh are well aware that these changes are happening. And so when we look at food security and sort of wider poverty, which this project's all about, is a concern. And really, there's sort of, I suppose, in terms of the kinds of questions that we're going to be asking, which of these drivers are most important? There's uncertainty around the drivers, but can we actually come up with some sort of ranking? Clearly, the drivers also interact with each other. That's something to think about. What responses can actually help and give us some steerage towards conditions that people might want through the 21st century? I mean, importantly, I've stressed the participatory nature of this. How does this relate to local concerns? So these two issues here are very, very coupled. And again, another question linked very strongly is, how can this knowledge help to shape the future? And there, again, working with our colleagues in Bangladesh, I think, is obviously a very key point to making sure that this knowledge is most readily made available for action on the ground. Thank you very much.